Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the ESA webinar series, sponsored by our good friends at Site for making this possible and keeping it free for everyone. Today's webinar is sponsored by the good folks over at Trace Associates, so thank you to Trace. Just some housekeeping. Presentations and recordings are available at www.esa.org/webinars. Usually the recordings and PowerPoints as PDFs are available by the end of the day. A reminder that we've converted Envirotech on June 11th and 12th to a virtual event with 27 presentations over 2 days. We've kept registration really cheap to help everyone out. It's only $49 for members and $79 for non-members, so we'd appreciate your support. A reminder at the end of the presentation today, we'll do Q&A, and you can do the questions through the question functions that you should all have on your control panels in the webinar. So we'll get started here with an update on the Orphan Wells and the Alberta Site Rehabilitation Program with Brad Gilmore, Keely Cameron, and Stephanie Ridge from Bennett Jones LLP in Calgary. And I'm just going to switch over control and we'll get started. So thanks to the three of you for doing this. Much appreciated.
All right, are we ready to go, Joe?
Yeah, as soon as Stephanie's screen's up.
It's just loading. How are we looking?
Yeah, we're ready.
Are we ready? All right, well, great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to the sponsors, thanks to the ESAA for hosting this seminar on what I know is a topic of great interest. Hope everybody is doing well out there. I saw a lot of familiar names on the attendee list, and it made me automatically think that I wanted to go grab a beer in James Joyce with folks, but that's going to have to wait for a time. But certainly hope everybody's doing well under the circumstances. So my name is Brad Gilmore. I head up the Regulatory Environment Department at Bennett Jones, and my practice is environmental and regulatory type law. Joining me today is Keely Cameron. Many of you will know Keely. Keely was previously counsel with the Alberta Energy Regulator. She was lead counsel for the Alberta Energy Regulator on the Redwater case, which I think we talk about briefly in this presentation. And then we were very happy that she came over after that and joined us here at our firm, and now combines her practice in litigation and regulatory matters. And then Stephanie Ridge, who will also be presenting today, is an associate in our regulatory department, and Stephanie is also very familiar with this site rehabilitation program and has been instrumental in not only preparing the presentation, but a number of the blogs that we have on our website. And so some of you may know, I mean, here's what happens when lawyers get slow. We write a lot of blogs. So if you go to our website, bennettjones.com, you'll find a lot of blogs about a variety of different topics, many of them related to COVID. But in particular, we have two up on this particular program. And I understand that today we will be having one going up on the British Columbia program or equivalent program. And Keely and Stephanie have put together a blog on that, and that'll be going up later today. So if you're interested, these are fairly easy to find on our website. So Steph, if you can take us to the next slide. Just so by way of introduction and an overview of what we want to accomplish today, and certainly save lots of time for questions, I am going to start by just giving a basic overview of the liability landscape in Alberta as it relates to the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And then I will discuss some amendments to the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and the Pipeline Act that have been that will be implemented through Bill 12, the Liability Management Statutes Amendment Act 2020. And then I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie and Keely to talk about the site rehabilitation program and some practical considerations for industry in light of that program. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so just generally, and I think people on this line will be very familiar with what the liability scenario generally is in Alberta, but for licensees that hold licenses from the Alberta Energy Regulator in relation to upstream oil and gas facilities, along with that license goes an obligation to abandon and reclaim the lands and carry out things like remediation and the like. Under our legislation currently, there's generally no specific timeline to have that those activities completed, and would generally be required in circumstances where it's directed or ordered by in this case, the Alberta Energy Regulator. We have a system that's been in place for quite some time through the Alberta Energy Regulator to keep a measure of the assets to the liabilities of each licensee. It's updated on a monthly basis. It's called the Liability Rating Program, or the LLR, which is a basic ratio of assets to liabilities. And when those assets to liabilities get out of balance, there's a requirement to post security with the AER, and that security can be used to deal with end-of-life type issues. In circumstances where the licensee becomes defunct, this is part of the COVID situation, right? We always hear things going on in the background. My youngest daughter plays tenor sax and still has her band lessons. So on a regular basis, when I'm having conference calls, we'll hear tenor sax in the background. In terms of the end-of-life liabilities, if a licensee becomes insolvent, defunct, then assuming that the pipeline well facility is covered by the Orphan well program, then typically those responsibilities and costs are transferred to that program. As folks on this line will know, the inventory of wells in Alberta that are being held by the Orphan Well Association has grown substantially over the last several years. It continues to grow. I've worked with the OWA really since it started a couple of decades ago, and I think the inventory was typically on the order of 10 wells as of May 1, 2020, and this is available on their website. They're sitting at about 3,000 orphan wells for abandonment, around 300 orphan facilities for decommissioning, 3,800 or so orphan pipeline segments for abandonment, and around 3,200 orphan sites for reclamation. So, the issue and the inventory has grown dramatically over the last several years, and unfortunately likely to continue. So that's why I think we're seeing a lot of these legislative changes and programs that are coming in to deal with not only that situation, but obviously the current economic situation generally. A part of the impetus for the amendments to the two acts that I'll be speaking about in a moment was really the outcome of the Orphan Well Association Grant Thornton case, which I refer to as the Redwater case. Most people refer to it as the Redwater case. And that really was an important decision for the province in terms of how end-of-life liabilities will be dealt with in a bankruptcy situation. And there's lots of things in that decision. It's the Supreme Court of Canada decision, but I think the two main things that come out of that is that it confirmed that the Alberta Energy Regulator has the power to impose cleanup conditions on a license holder, and by definition, the license holder will include a receiver or trustee, and that those powers and those obligations survive bankruptcy. So really a lot of the legislation is around that. In terms of dealing with the magnitude of the inventory of orphans, along with this program, we've seen over the last a while that both provincial and federal funding has been coming to the Orphan Well Association into the sector to deal with orphans and inactive oil and gas wells. In terms of the primary amendments to the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and Pipeline Act through Bill 12, first of all, it was introduced just a few weeks ago, will be implemented on proclamation. It includes amendments to the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and the Pipeline Act. So it doesn't cover other areas where we have end-of-life liability issues in the province as well. Oil sands, coal mines, coal projects are not included through these amendments. Some of the primary changes really relate to creating new duties for licensees and working interest participants, which I'll talk about in a moment, and allowing for the continued operation of assets where a licensee is incapable of carrying out proper operation, where that responsibility could eventually be delegated to the Orphan Well Association. Next slide. Next slide, Stace, or Steph, sorry. Okay, here we go. I'm looking at the wrong screen here. So the new duty, there is a new duty on licensees and approval holders. Again, this is under the OGCA and the Pipeline Act to provide reasonable care and measures. And under the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, that's under section 20, the new section 26.2, and under the Pipeline Act 22.1, reasonable care and measures to prevent impairment or damage, which is a defined term. So impairment or damage is defined, which where that result in or could reasonably be expected to result in harm to the integrity of the well, facility, pipeline, the environment, human health, safety, or property. So those of you that are familiar with the Environmental Protection Enhancement Act might see some familiar wording in there if you look at the definition of adverse effect. So it's similar, this impairment or damage comment is, our concept is similar to the definition of adverse effect under the Environmental Protection Enhancement Act. Reasonable care and measures, you know, that's an interesting set of words, and these provisions are interesting. Generally speaking, it really provides a broad range of interpretations in terms of what does reasonable care and measures mean and impairment of or damage to. So there's lots of room for subjective interpretation. In terms of what that means, the amendments would seem to suggest that that will be determined over time through directives, regulations, rules, or directions specifically from the AER. These obligations at first instance fall to the licensee or the approval holder. If in the opinion of the Alberta Energy Regulator they're not being fulfilled by those parties, then those obligations can then extend to the working interest participants in the well to provide reasonable care and measures. And in other circumstances, the AER can issue orders to licensees, working interest participants, or a delegated authority if the reasonable care measures are not being undertaken. And the most obvious delegated authority would be the Orphan Well Association. Next slide. The other one other element is the ability under the Act to allow for a delegated authority, again, most obviously the Orphan Well Association, to continue operations where it takes over management or control of a well or facility. So this is a very interesting new provision. It provides, I think, for circumstances to allow the OWA where there's risks associated with the wells and facilities that are not being operated appropriately to take over that management for the presumably the best interest of the environment, public health, safety, and preservation of the resource and those sorts of things. But what's interesting there is that if production occurs, it can only be done with the consent of the owner or holder of the mineral rights, which raises a series of other interesting questions and potential practical complications, but nevertheless, that's how it is written today. Any proceeds generated from that are limited under the Act to be used for the costs and expenses associated with the management and control. They can then be applied to outstanding debts owing to the Alberta Energy Regulator beyond that, and then the remaining funds would be provided to the Ministry of Energy, and that process is set out under the legislation as to in terms of distribution of funds. Next slide, and then I'll pass it over to Stephanie, I believe. Just other notable changes. While the OWA does undertake things like remediation, and remediation is certainly a notable end-of-life obligation, the Oil and Gas Conservation Act in particular, didn't speak to remediation in particular or remediation costs. Those definitions have now been incorporated into statute, so remediation and remediation costs are now incorporated into the statute along with things like reclamation and reclamation costs. The orphan funds, if you go to Section 70 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, you'll see that there are a much broader ranges of potential uses of orphan funds, including things like paying the cost of a receiver or a receiver manager in an insolvency situation. And then finally, a broad new regulation making power related to the fund itself and for the use of funds. And I think this will allow for further development of policy as we go along to continue to make changes to how we manage end-of-life liabilities under the Oil and Gas Conservation Act and the Pipeline Act. And with that, I will hand it over to Steph.
Thanks, Brad. So I know that everyone here is probably fairly familiar with the site rehabilitation program. So what I'm going to do is provide a broad overview and then hand it over to Keely Cameron, who's going to provide some insight into a few implementation issues and points of interest that have come up as the program has been implemented. So the Alberta Site Rehabilitation Program is Alberta's program by which to administer the $1 billion in federal funding that was received from the federal government under their COVID-19 economic response plan. And money from that, those funds were made available to Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan for the purpose of cleaning up orphan or inactive oil and gas wells, pipelines, and facilities. So the site rehabilitation program is Alberta's administration of those funds. So as we have seen in the details of the program, it really has been described as a back to work initiative. It's aimed squarely at oil field service companies and contractors, and how the program is being administered reflects that fact. So as everyone is likely aware, it is the contractor who goes to the licensee, enters into an agreement to conduct specified and permitted work, and then the contractor goes to Alberta Energy, applies for grant funding, and then themselves receives the grant funding. So the licensee at no point is the party who's receiving the funds. Similarly, the program is not aimed at orphan wells held by the Orphan Well Association. It's applying to sites that are not currently in the orphan wells, in the care of the Orphan Well Association. So a few details on what is included. We have a list of activities that are eligible for grant funding. This includes closure work on inactive wells and pipelines, environmental site assessments, remediation, reclamation, and the preparation of applications for remediation and reclamation certificates. We know that other activities are not permitted to receive grants. This includes suspension activities, non-closure work, so on producing sites. So for example, if there's a spill remediation to be done, that would not be eligible for funding under the grant. Similarly, as I've mentioned, work on orphan wells closure outside of Alberta is inside and outside of Alberta is of course not permitted. And any work that's been completed before the program came into effect on May 1, 2020 would, as you can imagine, not be eligible. A few interesting details that have come to light since the program was first announced on April 24th. As people are aware, applications started being received on May 1st. A few more details have been released since then. Where there is a prime contractor who's submitting an application and they intend to use subcontractors, the administration fees of that prime subcontractor, so to work with a contractor, those have been deemed ineligible. So a standard markup can't be claimed against a grant. Any costs of work to prepare contract bids, grant applications, and project contracts, those kind of costs are also ineligible for funding. And then other costs that aren't directly related to the cleanup at the site So for example, food, beverages, any of those non-work related expenses. We're also, as I've noted, sites in the care of the Orphan Wells Association are not eligible. And similarly, in-house oil field service providers cannot apply for these grants so far. So the funding, we have $1 billion of funding that will be allocated under this program, or that the government intends to allocate under this program. It's going to be separated out into increments. So the first increment was to be doled out, or applications were going to be accepted between May 1st and May 31st. So far, there has been a very high volume of applications. It's Alberta Energy commented that it is in the tens of thousands. So they recently also indicated on their website that they've received enough applications already to fill up that first $100 million of funding. And so they're actually going to be closing the application period today, which is 15 days early. So that's quite a bit of demand. So what they've been doing with the increments is setting specific criteria for the type of activities that can be applied for to receive grant funding. So this first increment was to be $100 million for oil and gas sites that need abandonment or reclamation in Alberta for up to $30,000 per application per closure activity. So the Department of Energy has been clear that more than one activity can be applied for a site. So you might apply for reclamation funding, or for example, a phase 1 environmental site assessment, and then later, if required, a phase 2 or the reclamation activity, a further reclamation activity that might be required to close that site. That would be, contractors are eligible to apply for $30,000 per activity, even if it's at the same site. This initial increment of funding was intended to be applicable to projects that require 100% government funding. In the early stages of the program's release, the licensee's ability to contribute to activities was going to be a factor in determining how much money was allocated. However, at this point, based on the enormous demand, the Department of Energy has advised that at this point in time, they're going by a first come, first served basis, and that they're simply looking at the reasonableness of the costs for the activity proposed. They are not looking at the licensee's ability to contribute to the activity in question. So the second increment of funding, the applications will open next week. There's now not a single date. They've advised that it's going to be the week of, I believe it is May 19th. So stay tuned for when those applications are going to open up. This second increment is going to be directed at sites where the government is currently paying compensation to landowners as required under Section 36 of the Surface Rights Act. So these are being referred to as Section 36 lands. As Keely's going to may touch on, there's some questions involved in how that will be administered. But again, we're looking at 100% of the funding being covered by the program. And it's again going to be for contracts of up to $30,000 per activity per application. And we're also going to see that that will open up from May 15th to June 15th. I'd suggest that based on the interest shown in the first round, that money is likely to go quickly, and it's going to be first come, first serve, or the application capacity. And that'll make up the first $200 million of this potentially $1 billion program. We're going to be seeing third and later increments. The criteria that will be applied in those increments is currently unknown, and we'll just have to keep an eye on things as that's updated and they roll out the next increments. And I think, I'm sorry, I just got a bit of a frozen screen here. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Keely Cameron to discuss some of the practical considerations that have arisen out of the program.
Thanks, Stephanie. So we've been working with a number of licensees and service companies in preparing their agreements under this program. If parties are looking to use their standard contracts as part of their submission for the program, it's important to ensure that those agreements comply with the requirements under the program, including having provisions related to COVID requirements and safety provisions under the agreement, as well as ensuring that the agreement has no subject to conditionality clauses that tie the agreement and performance under that agreement to a successful grant application. Any agreements must also set out the scope of work being applied for, key milestones, who will be doing the work, and the overall cost of the work being completed. This is especially important where the prime contractor is submitting the agreement on behalf of all the subcontractors, that it's very clear in terms of who's doing what work, because that'll impact how the grant money is distributed, as well as that it's very clear in terms of what work's being completed to try to minimize the number of expenses that are actually excluded through the program. What we've also been encouraging parties to do is to ensure that there's clarity and the contractor and licensee are aligned in terms of what steps will be taken in terms of whether the project will be delayed should the grant money not be provided. As touched on by Stephanie, in the 2 weeks since the program's been introduced, we've already seen a number of changes from what was initially reported in terms of the intentions of the program and requirements. So it's very important that when seeking to apply and participate under the program, that you check the government's website regularly, as they're constantly updating their website with additional clarification. Also, in terms of looking at the program and what changes might come in the future, as we briefly mentioned, British Columbia has just announced their first phase of their program for rolling out the federal funding. This program is similar to Alberta's program in that it's targeted to service companies. However, in order to be an eligible service company in terms of seeking funding, you must be registered in BC. So it has to be a BC corporation. It's not clear whether extra provincially registered corporations would also qualify. Also, other differences with BC's program is that it's more focused on moving sites throughout the entire life cycle. So you actually have to apply to bring a site fully through to reclamation. And projects are not limited to projects under 30,000, but they can be for any amount of funding. However, under the program, BC is only providing up to $100,000 per project, with the grant money being limited to 50% of the cost of the project. Now, that difference in BC makes more sense in that in British Columbia, there actually are some requirements for closure work, which makes it such that notwithstanding current financial limitations that companies may be experiencing during this downturn, that in BC there continues to be actual requirements that have to be met to carry out closure works. And those requirements are part of their dormant site program, which looks at sites that have been inactive for 5 years or more. In terms of some of the uncertainties that we're expecting to see as Alberta's program moves forward, one of the first ones is how the Section 36 application process will apply. We expect to see further revisions from the first phase of the program, as well as clarity in terms of who actually qualifies and what will occur where you have a licensee who's not around to sign off on the work in terms of these Section 36 applications. Another uncertainty with this next round of applications is whether sites that are subject to insolvencies will be a candidate, because often when a company goes into receivership or bankruptcy, landowners are not obtaining surface lease payments. However, such payments tend to be stayed under those insolvency orders, so it's unclear whether or not those sites will apply. We also too are looking at how the landowner nomination process will apply in terms of what the application process will look like and what notice will be provided to the landowner, because early indications have been provided that the licensee must still sign off on any nominated sites in order for them to move forward and obtain grant funding. Under British Columbia's program, they've actually expanded the nomination programs to also include municipalities, as well as Indigenous communities can also nominate sites for closure work. Given that new development in BC, we might see similar expansions of the nomination process in Alberta as well. And so just generally in terms of a summary, there's a number of questions that remain to be seen. We expect further details as well as further amendments to the program as things progress. Once Saskatchewan announces their details, we expect that could also further influence what happens in Alberta and British Columbia. As mentioned with Bill 12, it isn't currently in effect right now. So again, as Bill 12 eventually comes into effect and regulations start to get developed, we again expect to see further amendments and a number of questions that we'll be looking at and hoping to address through further blog series.
Just give me 1 second here, sorry. Thanks, Brad, Stephanie, and Keely for the presentation and information. I already have a bunch of questions piled in, and I'll be honest, just looking at some of them, I don't know if we're going to be able to answer some of the questions, as some of the questions are more comments about the process and AER, or Alberta Energy and what they're doing, and but we'll try. So is basic subsistence covered, like the standard, like $50 a day when working in remote areas?
It's unclear whether those costs would be covered, and we won't know until we start seeing some of the initial grant approvals coming back to parties. But what I would encourage companies to do if they're uncertain is there are email addresses and phone numbers that you can contact to ask questions of Alberta Energy, and they are trying to post those responses on their website.
Okay. What is meant by an in-house contractor?
In-house contractors applies more to where the licensee has those in-house capabilities. So a licensee itself cannot apply as a contractor to carry out the work on their own sites. What's uncertain is whether a licensee who has in-house capabilities, whether they may be permitted to file an application to carry out work where, for example, they're not the licensee but have a working interest or are looking to diversify and carry out that work on other licensees' sites.
Okay. Alan's asking, where did you find out that they were closing today, 15 days earlier? Someone says they can't find it on the site or on any notifications.
It is actually posted on their website. There's an information box on the main page for the program.
Okay. And are they opening the second funding today, or is that delayed? Because I think today was the date.
Yes, so the second series of funding opens the week of the 19th, so next week, but it's unclear right now on what day applications will be opening.
Okay. How would industry be able to determine which sites where government is paying landowner compensation?
That's a good question. Likely they would need to reach out to the Surface Rights Board or see if the information's available on their website in order to determine that, or else through discussions between service companies and licensees that they work with.
Okay, just bear with me. Do sites have to be fully remediated or reclaimed for the grant to be paid, or just on the portion that was applied for? I would assume it's just on the portion applied for.
Correct. So the grant funding, in order to be paid out in full, the scope of work set out in the agreement that was submitted and approved has to be completed and signed off on by the licensee.
Okay. Do companies need to reapply for a well site work for every increment of the program? Like if it's multiple stages and it's the same site?
Yes, so each grant is specific to a specific scope of work. So any amendments or expansions on that scope of work or additional work intended to be completed has to be currently applied for in a separate application.
Okay. Can you confirm the benchmark for activities to ensure no artificial cost inflation and create a fair and equitable program for contractors? There is some discussion where there is significant lowballing of rates by industry on contractors to the point of companies losing money. Any comments?
The only comment I would have, and this is an effect that'll have to be monitored with the initial stage of the program, is under phase one, the work was specifically limited to work that could be completed within that $30,000 amount. So in doing that, that's kind of created a restriction in terms of fees that can be charged for those types of activities. But also, as mentioned on Alberta Energy's website, they will be looking at rates from the Orphan Well Association to assess the reasonableness of rates that are being proposed.
Can Keely clarify what she means when she states applications are being rejected for work with costs greater than $30,000 when the grant is less than $30,000? Does this mean that if a job is $60,000 but applied for by 3 contractors at $20,000 a piece, that would be rejected?
So under that factual scenario, it's uncertain. What we've been advised by Alberta Energy under the first phase is if an application is submitted for a scope of work that's 60,000, for example, it will be rejected, that the scope of work has to be limited to work that can be completed within that 30,000 threshold. What's unclear is whether or not each subcontractor could submit separate contracts for 30,000 and whether or not that would be accepted. From my understanding, that likely would not fit within the scope of the current phase of the program.
Okay, any information yet on the Saskatchewan program implementation?
The Saskatchewan program has not been introduced yet. My guess is they're waiting to watch and see what happens with the initial rollouts in Alberta and BC and learn from that.
Okay. For BC, it was indicated that proposal would need to include scope all the way to reclamation. Can you confirm you are saying if your application is only for, say, a stage 2 or remediation, it will not be considered?
We're still waiting on further details of the program, but right now it looks like grant money is being limited to projects that are looking to take a site fully through to reclamation.
There's a question about the Orphan Well program and amount of money they have this year and what they're doing with the money, because I think they received extra, didn't they?
Yeah, so they have received recently additional funding from the federal government. So the details in terms of that, as far as I understand it, are still being worked out. But it's similar to my understanding of funds that they previously received from the province, where it's a loan that would need to be paid back over a period of time, but with the same sort of idea of getting more activity and more involvement in getting some of the orphans addressed and dealt with.
Okay. Since you're doing a first come, first served basis for the first round, if application didn't make it through in the first round, just because of lack of funding, do they need to apply again for the second round, or does it carry over?
Right now, it looks like for each round of applications, new applications will need to be submitted. Hopefully, feedback will be provided to those companies who had their applications rejected, so that they can make amendments for the next round of applications, provided their projects meet the scope of work that's being considered. Another interesting new update on Alberta Energy's website is they are providing for applications that have been accepted a limited period of time to actually file amendments to those applications. It's not clear yet what the scope of such amendments are intended to include, but that's something to certainly follow on Alberta Energy's website.
Okay. I think I know the answer to this one, but can wells that are not oil and gas, former brine mine or salt storage caverns be applied? And I know the answer is no. So is that correct?
That's our understanding, that currently the program's limited to conventional oil and gas wells and pipelines.
Okay. How do service providers identify sites licensees under Section 36?
So we already touched that a bit. One resource would be the Surface Rights Board. Another resource may also be the Alberta Energy Regulator's website, as often sites that are subject to Section 36 orders are also subject to abandonment orders through the Alberta Energy Regulator.
Okay. Are applications allowed or accepted for green zone public sites in period 2? I don't think we know yet. Is anyone aware of any grants being approved yet?
No.
Okay. Has there been a change? When we did our webinar, I think last week, AER said they hadn't decided if they were going to release, or Alberta Energy hasn't decided if they were going to release a list of who received funding out of the program. Has that changed?
Stephanie, do you want to comment on that?
Not that I'm aware of. I haven't seen any update to that effect.
Okay. I hope they do. I hope they do for transparency point of view. Are existing oil companies available to apply for funding?
So I think we already commented on that. Oil companies can't apply for funding for work that they would be carrying out themselves, but they can certainly have third-party contractors apply for work to be carried out on their sites, and they may be able to apply to carry out work on a different licensee's site.
Okay. Does the Orphan Well Association have access to this program?
No, they're independent.
Okay. Are we required to submit proof of surface lease rental payment with our application on private land? What is prioritizing grant approvals?
So currently, as Stephanie mentioned, grant approvals, at least for the initial phase, were being done on a first come, first served basis. So that's how the funds are being released, based on first submitted applications that are complete. In terms of what will be required to be submitted for this second phase, the Section 36 phase, it's unclear. We won't know until next week and we see the approval process, but I assume there will be some requirement to submit something as evidence to demonstrate that they meet the requirements of the funding.
Are there the changes to how orphan well funds can be used meant to get around the Redwater decision, going to receivers?
Can you read that? Can you read that one again, Joe?
Are the changes to how orphan well funds can be used, i.e. go to receivers, meant to get around the Redwater decision?
Oh, I see. No, I don't think they're meant to get around the Redwater decision. What they're trying to do is deal with a situation. I guess it depends how you look at it, but I think they're trying to deal with a situation where a secured creditor, Keely, you may want to comment on this further, but a secured creditor is not in a position to appoint a receiver. And in those circumstances, to have that happen, and again, this is going to require some amendments to the regulation that delegates authorities to the Orphan Well Association. That hasn't happened yet, but if that were to happen, it would, provide for situations where a receiver is not otherwise appointed, and that's necessary for the appropriate management of the assets. Keely, did you have anything further you wanted to say on that?
Yeah, so this provision is actually really to assist in minimizing the number of orphans that end up with the Orphan Well Association, to ensure that where there isn't a secured creditor who is in a position to have a receiver appointed, that there's still this mechanism to enable the OWA or the AER to appoint a receiver so that a sales process can be run to try to minimize the number of wells that actually end up with the Orphan Well Association, and to ensure there's that responsible party in the interim who can manage and oversee those assets.
Okay. How stringent is the requirements that the sites be Alberta sites and Alberta companies? This person lives in Lloydminster on the border, but they live on the Saskatchewan side. The company's on the Saskatchewan side, but most of their work is in Alberta.
I can speak to that one. I think it's quite stringent that the site be in Alberta.
Okay.
In terms of the location of the contractor themselves, Alberta, that would be a good question to submit to Alberta Energy through the website, the emails that are listed there. I know that in the webinar that Isa kindly hosted last week, Alberta Energy indicated that there might be some wiggle room there, but again, that's a good question for Alberta Energy.
Okay, this is unrelated, but I think it's important. Can the panel comment on the decision to allow companies to stop completing and reporting environmental monitoring?
Maybe I'll take a first shot at that. I think, and we do have a couple of blogs on this as well. So if you want to go on to our website, you'll find some blogs with some of these changes, and they of course have been changing over time, but at least the first series were really in relation to relatively routine monitoring requirements and the like. So there's still an obligation to keep the data and provide it and all those sorts of things. So it was really just more of an issue of providing a COVID type abilities to manage that type of data management on relatively routine matters, but certainly things like releases and spills or things that would otherwise need reporting still need to be reported, and so I don't see it as particularly significant from my perspective, anyways.
And if I could jump in here as well, one thing that Brad and I discussed quite a bit when putting together these blogs is that often it's really specific, so you really want to be very careful to ensure that the reporting obligation that's been paused in fact applies to your reporting obligation. The other thing to keep in mind is that often it's not the monitoring or the data collection that has been paused, it's the reporting obligation. So just do exercise a high degree of caution. It's certainly not a blanket relief measure.
Yeah, I understand that they have to still do all the monitoring and all the stuff that they order. They just don't have to file the reports at this point. What changes does do you expect, probably for you, Brad, changes do you expect to see at the Orphan well in the future as they start operating wells and facilities?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's still obviously a work in progress. I think what we're going to likely see next is maybe some further amendments to the legislation to allow for a broader role of the Orphan Well Association. But I think that, you know, obviously, like a lot of these things, it's just going to continue to develop over time, and we'll have to wait and see.
So do you expect the Orphan well will assume some or all of the administration of the program over time, given the take-up for the program? Or is Energy going to continue running the billion-dollar program?
No, I see them as, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, I see them as independent. So certain funding is going to the Orphan Well Association. And then the OWA will continue to work with the AER in terms of that. But as we said earlier, these two particular programs are independent of each other.
Okay. Companies receive a notification if their application was rejected, right? Or if there was errors in it?
Yes, that's our understanding.
If a phase 2 is completed, is a report of contamination found need to be reported to AER?
Maybe I'll tackle that one. I would say probably yes. You'll want to look at the remediation regulations, and that's where really the most up-to-date amendments are to the reporting obligations in the context of doing phase 1s, phase 2s, and the like. So generally speaking, you'd want to look at that carefully, but I think in a lot of circumstances it would require reporting.
Also, under the grant program, at the conclusion of the work, a report is required to be submitted that sets out the status of the site and current characteristics after the work's been completed. And there is some sharing capabilities for Alberta Energy to share some of the information submitted with the Alberta Energy Regulator. So again, it's important to not only know what your requirements are under environmental legislation, but also recognize if you don't comply with that requirement and the report is submitted through Alberta Energy as part of this program, you do run the risk of being in non-compliance with your requirements.
Okay. Is there any indication that future phases might include oil sands or waste management facilities, or is it strictly going to be conventional oil and gas?
I think it remains to be seen, but so far the program does seem to be focused on inactive wells and getting the largest number of sites cleaned up.
What do you mean about COVID safety provisions in the contract?
Sure. So there is a requirement as part of an agreement between the licensee and the contractor to ensure that in carrying out of any work under the contract that it's done in accordance with occupational health and safety requirements, including necessary requirements that have been imposed as a result of COVID-19.
Okay. Do we know if anyone's received any rejections yet? That's come up a few times in the questions here.
My understanding is that some rejections have gone out through the website. Just to look at the website, they provide some more commentary on that and what parties can expect to see.
Okay. And just back to the monitoring, there's a comment here that monitoring is waived for CNRL, Syncrude, and Suncor and Imperial Oil. Is that true?
I don't have any specifics on that. I don't know if you guys do.
No.
There are so many COVID measures and they can be quite specific. So it really is case by case.
Okay. And I think we'll do 2 more, and because there's so many, and then we'll call it a day. We could be here all day, like the one that we did with Alberta Energy. We had over 300 questions. We're approaching over 100 here. So, and I will, for everyone online, I will try to get Lars on as from the Orphan well to do a presentation. Him and I have been talking. He's just waiting for more information on their new funding and what the process is going to be. So we'll just give us some time. Who assumes the environmental liability associated with the remediation of the sites under this program?
So the liability and responsibility remains with the licensee under the program. However, of course, again, through the contracts with the contractor, it may apportion some liability and some responsibilities in accordance with the work being carried out.
Okay, and has Alberta Energy posted a sample contract between an applicant and Alberta Energy, so people can see it? Or?
No, we haven't seen that on the website. I assume if you register and go into the actual application process, that you may see that type of contract. But I know as of the last 2 weeks, they were still working on finalizing that agreement. And now that they're starting to approve various grant applications, I suspect we'll see it shortly.
Okay, and just one more comment back to monitoring. Someone else has stepped in and said that as of recently, there's been waived on many sites for COVID-19 reasons, monitoring. So it's something I might have to look into for potentially another webinar with some people to see if that's the case, because that's bread and butter for a lot of consulting companies in this province and keeping people to work by doing monitoring and reporting work. So I think with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Brad, Keely, Stephanie, for your time today. Enjoy your long weekend. Thank you to Site Energy for making these webinars possible and free. And thank you to the Trace Associates for sponsoring today. Really appreciate it. Reminder that the webinar will be posted later today at isa.org/webinars. And if Stephanie or one of you could send me a PDF copy of your presentation, that would be great. We'll post that as well. And a reminder about Envirotech coming up. If you could register, that would be greatly appreciated. Help ISA out a lot. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, guys, and have a great long weekend and stay safe.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.